Well, I'm anxious to see all of you alert people out there just dying to learn, because this is an exploding area in medicine. It's going to affect so many things. So I know I'm really looking forward to this talk. So we're going to start with Dr. David Chan. He is the author of the highly acclaimed book, Breast Cancer, Real Questions, Real Answers, A Guide for Patients and Families. Dr. Chan graduated from medical school and completed his residency in internal medicine at UCLA, where he spent a year teaching before moving on to Stanford to train in oncology. Dr. Chan is a long-standing instructor at the Revlon UCLA Breast Center and has trained numerous med students and oncologists in breast cancer treatment. He was instrumental in developing the UCLA Translational Research Institute, a clinical research program affiliated with the UCLA Division of Hematology Oncology that has included many clinical trials in breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, and lymphoma. Dr. Chan is a program director for oncology at Torrance Memorial Medical Center. Please welcome Dr. Chan.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, and welcome. It's nice to see a lot of friends here, and thanks for coming up and saying hi. We're really lucky to have Lauren here, join us in the past month. We've been working very hard to bring a very qualified, competent geneticist to the program, and she's going to be starting to see patients next week. So, welcome to Lauren, and we're looking forward to hearing from her. I'm going to give you a brief overview about breast cancer. This is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and I'm going to speak about genetics, but I'm also going to talk about risk factors, and then Lauren will get into much more detail in terms of the genetics of breast cancer and how we apply it, what we look for, and who benefits from that type of testing and counseling. So, how many people that think that cancer is caused by stress? Raise your hands. Pardon? How many people think that genetics plays a big role in breast cancer? Okay. So we got a lot to learn. Okay. This is one cancer cell. This is a breast cancer growth pattern. So this is one cancer cell. This is 2 cells. That's 4, and that's 8. It takes 100 days for one breast cancer cell to go into 2, and another 100 days to go into 4, and another 100 days to go into 8. So to get to a size that we typically see on mammogram, which is about 1 centimeter, this is an average mammogram. I think at Torrance Memorial with 3D technology, we're doing a lot better than that. But that's about an 8-year interval from the first cell to a billion cells. And to get to something that you could really feel with your fingers, that's another 2 years. That's a 10-year interval where the cancer's growing. So I have so many patients that come in and say, I have breast cancer and I'm so upset because my husband is such a jerk and last week he did this or that, or my son did this and it's just upsetting and that's why I have it. That's not why you have it. I mean, this thing's been there a while. So, one of the things that I just want to bring out here, and I just want to say that, I'm in the camp that women should get mammograms yearly, because you're depending upon a 2-year interval if we use the current guidelines, and I think that even though we're curing patients with larger cancers, We're needing to use more surgery and more chemotherapy to get there, so I still encourage women to get yearly mammograms. This is from about 10 years ago. It's a chart from the American Cancer Society, and it looks at the number of cancer cases from one country to the next. And there's a big range from North America, Australia, Northern Europe, Western Europe, and China, Africa, other Asian countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos. I mean, it's a factor of about 800% difference in terms of breast cancer risk. Why is that? It's really interesting. What we're seeing in the past 10 years or the past 15 years is that China is developing, Japan's developing, and as these countries develop, their breast cancer rates are starting to go up. The other thing, that if this was a genetic thing, we would think that if we have immigrants that come from China, immigrants that come from Japan, they marry other Chinese, other Japanese people of their same ethnicity, their rates don't stay like this. Their rates start going up after about 20 years of living in this country and start approaching what we see in the United States. So there's obviously something that's going on that's more than just genetics. Genetics is really important because all of us that treat breast cancer have this is a pedigree where we see from one generation to the next different members that have breast cancer. And obviously, when we have that type of hereditary pattern, there's something that's going on. And Lauren's going to be talking about that in more detail in the second half of this talk. But if we look at what happens in terms of genetics, we think that about 5 to 10% of breast cancers are really attributed to an identifiable inherited gene. There's another 15 or 20% of patients with breast cancer that have other family members that have breast cancer in the family. And we have a big group of 70 or 80% of patients with newly diagnosed breast cancer, and we get about maybe 270, 300,000 new breast cancer patients every year in the United States. About 70 to 80% of them don't have a first-degree relative that's had breast cancer. So one of the things that we hear a lot is, I don't know how I got this because nobody in my family had it. Well, welcome to the club. That's actually more the rule than the exception. Most of breast cancer is not inherited. So why do we get it? I'm going to show you, and I'm going to try to illustrate that breast cancer is really a disease of industrialized economic success in the lifestyle that goes along with it. We do know that breast cancer is a disease of aging. With every decade as we age, there's a higher chance of getting breast cancer for women. But about the biggest risk factor that we have in the United States for breast cancer is being overweight and being sedentary. And over decades of that type of lifestyle, that's thought to account for about 30 to 40% of that large pie slice in that circle that I showed you. Being very high in socioeconomic success within the country also accounts for another 30% of the breast cancer risk. So this is about the 70 or 80% risk that I showed you on that pie chart. As I mentioned, the genetic risks are 5 to 10%, maybe another 10 or 15% in the family clusters. And then postmenopausal estrogens, which gets a lot of press, it really only accounts for 1 or 2% of breast cancers. There's a big study called the Women's Health Initiative, and they showed that if you were postmenopausal, which is women that have gone through menopause and they take estrogen, that for every year of estrogen use, that it only increases a woman's risk of breast cancer by 0.1%. So over 10 years, 1%. It's a factor, but it's not a big factor. Alcohol also causes maybe 1 or 2% of breast cancer risks, but it's very hard to separate drinking alcohol from other lifestyle changes which may be more important, such as being overweight or not exercising. And as an independent variable, it's a little hard to tease out. And smoking also has maybe a 1 or 2% risk. But again, people that tend to smoke also tend to drink more. They tend to be overweight and tend to not exercise. So what's the deal with exercise and obesity? Why is that so important? You know, it turns out that in the next year that not only is being obese and sedentary going to be responsible for 30 to 40% of new breast cancers, but it's going to account for about 30 to 40% of all cancers. And it's going to surpass tobacco as the leading cause of cancer in the United States. So how does that work? What happens is that if we're overweight and we're not exercising, we tend to develop something called insulin resistance. In other words, we don't have enough muscle, our muscles don't take up blood sugar. And when that happens, our blood sugars go up and our pancreas has to make more insulin. And when we have patients that have this, they're set up to get something called metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. This is something that Dr. Miller treats a lot. It's epidemic in this country, and it's those same risk factors that put our patients at risk for more breast cancer, because blood sugar and insulin are stimulatory for cell proliferation. In other words, if we're trying to do lab testing of cell cultures to make the cancers grow faster, and it's not just breast cancer, but it's colon cancer, lung cancer, other cancers, we'll put sugar into the solution, we'll put insulin into the solution, and we get much more rapid growth. So we're trying to modify this, and there's a lot of things that are relatively new that have come out that are not hard to do. And I just kind of want to take a couple minutes and review that with you. What we're trying to do is to get people to reduce their calories and move them earlier in the day. So there's something that we do in America that they don't do in Europe and they don't do in a lot of other countries, and that is that we skip breakfast, we go to work, we eat a light lunch, we work like crazy, and then we go home and we eat a gigantic meal. And then we sit in front of the computer or we watch TV and we go to sleep. And when we do that, we're digesting our food at a time where we're at rest. And metabolically, that's really disadvantageous. We're running high blood sugars all through the night and high insulin levels. So if we can move our calories earlier in the day, we're trying to get people to eat a healthy breakfast, a healthy lunch, and then to eat an earlier European-style meal. Now, a lot of us have been to Europe as Americans, and we go to Italy or something, or we go to Spain, we sit down and we order this meal that's like the equivalent of 30 or 40 US dollars, and we get something that looks like this. And it looks like the appetizer, and that's like the meal. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're also trying to advocate having a period of 12 to 13 hours after dinner of no food, and that's called intermittent fasting. And when we look at just doing that as an intervention, the intermittent fasting, we're finding that if the calorie amount is the same, the metabolic effects of it are such that patients are still losing weight. And even if we have a patient that has had breast cancer, if they do intermittent fasting, they have a 1/5 lower chance of having that cancer spread or return. So we're trying to lower blood sugars and lower insulin levels. Another thing we're trying to do is really limit the simple carbs. And when people talk about sugar, they're not talking about eating a Snickers bar or M&Ms. I mean, it refers to things that are like bread, rice, and potatoes that are broken down very quickly into glucose. We have very rapid rises in blood sugar and very high insulin levels. So when we have, the lifestyle that we have, and we have metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, our insulin levels are high by a factor of 1 or 200%, and it's stimulatory to cell proliferation. If we can add to these steps, increase muscle mass with some exercise and cardio, we can probably prevent about 30 to 40% of cancers in the United States, and it's much better to do a prevention than to do a treatment. And this is a process that takes decades. If I've showed you how slow breast cancer takes to develop, colon cancer is not much difference than that. It's a 10-year period from the first cell to a large polyp. So lifestyle really plays a factor. If we look at what happens in the United States, the very wealthiest counties have the highest rate of breast cancer. Why is that? Well, one of the things is that we have plenty to eat. And so our girls go into, they start developing at a very early age. So in a third world country where there's not enough calories, maybe periods start at the age of 12 or 13. It's not uncommon now in the United States and in Palos Verdes for girls to start menstruating earlier than that, 9.5, 10. So you're starting breast stimulation earlier. What happens to our girls in PV Manhattan Beach as they're menstruating? They're going to school, they go to college, they start careers. They're very late getting married and very late having kids. In a third world country, what happens is that as menstruation starts, very often there's pregnancy in the teens, and after pregnancy, there's breastfeeding for 1 or 2 years. When that stops, there's another pregnancy, breastfeeding for 1 or 2 years, another pregnancy, breastfeeding for 1 or 2 years. It's not uncommon to be 21 or 22 and have 3 kids. And what that does, the pregnancy, the breastfeeding, is that it causes the breast ducts to mature, and it really shuts down the estrogen stimulation. When we have our young girls having periods early, their breasts are developing, they're just not having kids and they're not breastfeeding. They just have unopposed estrogen stimulating immature breast tissue over a very important time in breast development. And 30 or 40 years or 50 years later, it puts them at this 700, 800% higher risk of getting breast cancer compared to what happens in a third world country. So that's why in the United States and in Western Europe and in now very developed Japan and developing China, the breast cancer rates are going up. Okay, and this is just a graph. Marin County in the Bay Area is one of the very wealthiest counties in the country. And you can see from 1990 to 99, the breast cancer rate has just gone up incredibly compared to a lot of other counties in the Bay Area. And it's because of a lot of these factors that I'm talking about. In the urban parts of the United States where there's a lot of teen pregnancies, there tends to be a lower breast cancer risk, but because of the obesity things and stuff like that, it's not as low as in a third world country. Okay, so those are the risk factors that I deal with. I want to talk just briefly a little bit about something that Lauren's going to get into in a couple minutes. But the genetics are a factor in breast cancer, and they're a factor for me as a treating physician because it affects sometimes what type of surgeries I recommend for patients if they have an inherited breast cancer gene. But if you remember, I told you that only about 5 or 10% of patients with breast cancer have an identifiable gene. We do genetic testing, and 15 years ago it used to be BRCA1 or 2, N2. We don't do that anymore. We now do very expanded gene panels with gene sequencing, and they're reporting 35, 40 genes that are identified with all cancers that have a higher risk. I have people come in with 23andMe. How many of you have heard of that test? It's offered, I think it's less than $200. They report BRCA on 23andMe, but it's inaccurate because they only report 3 mutations that are the founder mutations that were initially identified in the Western European Jewish population. And that is an incomplete panel, and it's very misleading, and I think that somebody ought to do something about that because they report it out as BRCA negative, and it isn't. And I've had a number of patients that have had 23andMe that when we do another testing with another company that does the full sequencing, they have a mutation that was missed. Mutations are categorized as deleterious or variants. And when we see a deleterious mutation, that means that it's associated with a documented higher risk of getting cancer. Depending on what that cancer is and what that risk is, we try to do some type of intervention, which could be just increased monitoring. Some women, like if it's BRCA1 or 2, like that, the actress Angelina Jolie, had preventative surgery in her 40s. But a lot of variants are, mutations are what we call genetic variants, and they are not associated with higher cancer risk. And it's very important for patients' family to understand the difference. And I often use the analogy of, if everybody in Sweden was blonde and blue-eyed and somebody had brown hair, hazel eyes, that's a gene variant. It's not a disease. So it's very important to understand the difference between having a mutation that is associated with a higher cancer risk, which we call deleterious, and these variants that are more commonly reported that we really shouldn't worry that much about. The good thing is that these variants are they're followed by curators at the various companies, and they're often updated if they change to something that's associated with a higher cancer risk. So when we have a patient that has a genetic mutation, very often when they have breast cancer, we recommend or we suggest that they have bilateral mastectomies as their surgical treatment. They don't have to do that because it doesn't improve their cure rate. It just reduces their chance of getting a second breast cancer. I have patients that sometimes they're 35 or 38 and they're not ready to have mastectomy, so we treat them in the same way we treat a lot of other young women. Lumpectomy, radiation, the cure rates are very high, they're the same. And maybe they will elect to have a mastectomy and reconstruction 10 years later, depending on their life circumstances. So the breast surgery that we recommend is dependent upon having a deleterious mutation or not. For the patients that choose not to, and their family members that also test positive, and Lauren's going to talk about testing other family members, we often add additional screening, such as breast MRI. We do recommend ovarian surgery for the patients that have the BRCA mutations that are associated with a higher risk, because we don't have any screening for ovarian cancer that's considered accurate. Now that may change in 5 years with the advent of liquid biopsies that measure cell-free DNA, cancer DNA in the blood. There's 15 companies that are developing that. We're working with 5 of them right now at the center here, And we're hoping to bring this technology to market in the very near future. So it may be that in 5 years there will be an accurate screening blood test for a number of cancers, including ovarian cancer, but we don't have it today. So we're recommending in patients that have a BRCA1 mutation that they have their ovaries removed, their ovaries and tubes removed at the age of 35 if they've completed families. And if they have a BRCA2 mutation, then we're recommending it at the age of 40. Some of these BRCA mutations are associated with other cancers, like cancers of the pancreas or a skin cancer that's very dangerous called melanoma. And for them, we'll do additional screening if there's a family history, but very often we don't. We do talk about lifestyle changes to reduce breast cancer risk. And there's not a lot of effective ovarian cancer prevention. It's better to go ahead and just do the preventative surgery. So a lot of these things are in development, and we think things are going to change very quickly, just as the genetic tests have changed very quickly over the past decade. So that's as much as I have to say. Do you want to introduce Lauren? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chan. It sounds like you've been around this stuff for a while. So our next speaker is Lauren Rudichuk. She is the new Oncology Genetic Counselor at Torrance Memorial Medical Center. She joined the team approximately 2.5 months ago when she relocated from Canada. Lauren grew up in Calgary, Alberta, and completed her Bachelor's of Science degree in Genetic Counseling at Northwestern University. Lauren then returned home to Canada to work in a large genetics clinic that served patients from northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories. As the only genetic counselor at Torrance Memorial Medical Center, Lauren is excited about implementing alternative service delivery models for genetic testing and counseling for hereditary cancer in order to expand access to genetic services in the South Bay. Please welcome Lauren.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see so many people here. I'm very excited to be the new genetic counselor here at Torrance and to have joined this family here. It's a really great hospital and a great community, so I'm happy to be on board. Also really happy to coming down south from Canada, as a couple weeks ago when I was working on this presentation, my phone kept buzzing and I was looking at it, and all my friends and family were sending me pictures of snow from back home. There was about 3 feet of snow in 24 hours. We got a huge dump, so it was quite nice to send them back a picture of me on the beach, which I think they're a little bit jealous of. So happy to be down south for the next few years or so. So let me just see here how this works. All right. So I'm going to be focusing today on hereditary breast cancer and then genetic counseling. So a few of my objectives, I want to just give you a basic sort of overview of genetics and also what is the role of a genetic counselor. So what do I do on my day-to-day here? I'll talk more about hereditary cancer as in a general sense, and then a little bit more specifically about hereditary breast cancer. And then I'm going to talk about clinical genetic testing, along with comparing that to some of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing that's out there, such as Dr. Chan mentioned, 23andMe. So this is a picture that I often show most of my patients when they come in to see me. I always want to start right from the beginning because many people maybe have very limited knowledge about genetics, might have never learned about this in school or any time in their life, but they've heard a lot about it in the media. So what I always like to start with is just explaining that our body is made up of millions and millions of cells, and all of our cells contain our genetic information, which is our DNA. So our DNA is basically a string of chemical letters, kind of like our body's alphabet. So our DNA contains all of the instructions that our body needs to be able to grow, develop, and function on a day-to-day basis. And our DNA is contained in these structures called chromosomes. And our chromosomes are inherited in pairs. So we get one copy of every chromosome from our mom and one copy of every chromosome from our dad. That's why we look like our moms and our dads, because we share half of mom's genetic information and half of dad's genetic information. And small segments of our DNA here is what we call our genes. So genes are an individual instruction for our body. So our body contains about 20,000, 25,000 genes. We have genes for things like hair color, for height. We also have genes that are really important in our body to protect us from developing certain diseases and illnesses, such as cancer. So another analogy I like to use is always comparing it to something. So I love to bake. I love cookies and cake. So I like to compare it to something like this. So you can think of our genome. So that's the whole set of our genetic information present in every cell of our body. You can think of that as kind of like a set of recipe books. So we got one set of recipe books from our mom, one from our dad. And each chromosome is one of those recipe books. Each individual gene is one of those recipes, say for cookies. And our genes code for products called proteins that actually carry out the function of that gene in our cells. So that recipe codes for some delicious chocolate chip cookies here. So what is a gene mutation? Dr. Chan was kind of talking about this. So a change in a gene that stops the gene from doing its normal job. So here you can see a string of letters. And so maybe it could be something as small as a little spelling mistake. So say at this position here in the gene, we're supposed to have a G. Everyone has a G there, let's say, but you have a C. So it could be as small as a single spelling mistake that causes that gene not to work properly. And so instead of producing the normal protein, it's now producing an abnormal protein that maybe doesn't work properly, or no protein at all. So lots of our changes in our genes don't do this. They don't, lead to any abnormal protein. They're just variations between people and really have no, medical consequence, but just kind of cause the differences between all of us. But sometimes these changes can be very important and lead to abnormal or no protein at all. So what does a genetic counselor do? I don't know how many of you guys have even heard the term genetic counselor before and wonder what I would do. Some people think that I do designer babies and all kinds of crazy things. The scary thing is, sort of seems like some days that's where society's heading, but hopefully not for a very long time. So what genetic counseling is a process to evaluate and to understand a family's risk of an inherited medical condition. So genetic counselors, we have training in both medical genetics and counseling. And really, we're just a member of your healthcare team. So I like to say that we evaluate, we educate, we counsel, and we support. So you might say, okay, well, what does that really mean? So for example, let's say a man gets referred to me because he has a strong family history, let's say of colon cancer. So he would get referred and I would take a very in-depth family history. So who in the family has colon cancer? What age do they have colon cancer at? How many family members have colon cancer? Is it mom's side of the family? Is it dad's side of the family? Is it both? And based on that information, is there a chance that there could be a hereditary cause of that cancer in the family? So what hereditary cancer syndrome could that be suggestive of, and how do we figure that out? So what genetic testing can we offer? What are the types of results we might get? If we do find out there is a genetic mutation that's being passed down through the family, what do we do about it? What's our screening? What's our management? And trying to walking through that whole entire process. So that's sort of the education piece. And then we counsel. So genetics affects not only the individual, but it affects families. That's what genetics is. And so how is this information going to affect you, but also your other family members? Who else is at risk for this genetic condition? And also, how might this information impact you psychologically, emotionally? Are you ready to get this information? Is now a good time to learn this information that you have a very high risk of cancer potentially? And another thing we do is we support. So some people don't want genetic testing right now. Some people do, and we support you either way. We're not going to tell you you have to or don't have to get testing. We're just leading you to these different options and helping you through that. And also support you with various resources and support groups to guide you through this. And I put up here This is aboutgeneticcounselors.com. It's a really great patient resource and website that I encourage you to go to if you want to learn more specifically about genetic counselors and all the different areas that we work in as well, which I will touch on. So lots of different areas that genetic counselors work on. It really started in prenatal genetics and pediatric genetics. That's where many genetic counselors worked for a number of years, and they still do, but it's definitely expanded over time. So now many genetic counselors work in neurology, in metabolics, in cardiovascular diseases, and also in cancer. And we work in many different areas as well, in different settings. So in universities, hospitals, in laboratories, and sometimes nonprofits and governments as well. So I circled cancer here because that's specifically what I'm doing here at Torrance. I'm the oncology genetic counselor, and I'll be focusing more on that today. So this is actually kind of a little different, I think, than what Dr. Chan said. When I say all cancer is genetic, really what I mean is that all cancer is caused by mutations in our genes. But that does not mean that those mutations are inherited through a family necessarily. Only about 5 to 10% of those mutations are passed down, and that's what we refer to as hereditary cancer. Whereas most people, as Dr. Chan mentioned, have sporadic cancer, so these mutations just accumulate as you go on throughout your life for many different reasons, such as that extra exposure to estrogen, obesity, all of those sorts of things can lead to increased risks of mutations, but oftentimes that's not inherited. So I'm going to just compare a little bit more on the molecular level. What's the difference between sporadic versus hereditary cancer? So a lot of the genes that are really important in protecting our body from getting cancer are called tumor suppressor genes. So they function to basically keep our body from not developing tumors. So they're really important in our cell cycle to make sure that our cells don't develop and grow out of control. They're kind of like the important checks on our cells. And so if someone normally has 2 copies of one of these tumor suppressor genes and they're both working fine, every cell of their body has both of these genes that work fine, but as they go throughout life, they acquire damage just from environmental exposures, lifestyle exposures, or maybe just a random mutation occurs in a cell when the cell's dividing. So if they get one mutation here, they still have that backup copy that works properly. So this isn't yet a cancer cell, it's still getting the instructions it needs from this backup copy. But as time goes on, maybe this cell gets that second hit in that second copy. Now this cell has lost the instructions that it needs to keep it from growing out of control. So this right away doesn't develop a cancer. You need more mutations to accumulate and more time, but eventually a tumor can develop. But when we compare that to hereditary cancer, this is when someone's born like this. Every single cell of their body has a mutation in it. So you're not born with cancer though, because you still have that backup copy. That works okay. But you have a higher chance then to only get that second hit. You don't need 1, 2, you just need 1. Then again, many more mutations to accumulate to get that cancer, but you have a much higher risk of developing cancer. So these hereditary cancer syndromes are often passed down in a family in what we call autosomal dominant inheritance. So basically what this means is that you have a 50-50 chance to pass it on. So it's not a 100% chance, but it's 50-50. And the reason for that, as I mentioned earlier, is that we only pass on 1 copy of every gene and every chromosome in our body. So if you have 1 mutation here and 1 copy that works properly, you have a 50-50 chance to pass that on to each of your children. And that is regardless of the gender. So both men and women can inherit these mutations. And I think that's something really important to remember, because oftentimes, especially when we're talking about breast cancer, ovarian cancer, these BRCA genes, people sometimes forget that men are just as likely to have these mutations. And so here, for instance, we have an affected father. He has that mutation in 1 copy of his gene, and he has a 50-50 chance to pass it on to each of his children. And so someone who inherits the mutation, we would call mutation positive. Again, increased risk for cancer does not mean they have cancer if they do the genetic testing. It just means increased risk though. And if they test them and they're negative, we would often say you're back down to the general population risk for cancer. So we don't need all of that increased screening and potential surgeries because you did not inherit that mutation that's causing the cancer in the other family members. you still always have a risk of cancer. We're not saying you're down to 0, but back down to oftentimes those general population risks. So some clues of hereditary cancer, kind of 4 big ones that we think about is young, rare, multiple, and family. So young cancers such as breast cancer under 50, triple negative, which is a special type of breast cancer, under 60, colon or endometrial cancer under 50 as well. So typically we're getting cancer later in life, kind of in our later 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. We're not expecting it when we're younger. And so if we are seeing it younger, that does raise a red flag. It doesn't mean for sure it's going to be a hereditary cause, but it starts to raise our suspicion a little bit. And then there's rare types of cancer. So many men would never get a breast cancer. It's quite a rare cancer for men to get, but they still can. And so if we see a male breast cancer, that raises our risk. Same thing with ovarian cancer and pancreatic cancer. And then for multiple, so sometimes people have more than one cancer themselves. So maybe a breast cancer and then an ovarian cancer, or maybe pancreatic and then melanoma. So things like that raise our risk or raise our suspicion. And same thing with bilateral cancer. So maybe both breasts, both kidneys, anything that we're seeing it in double organs. And a big thing too is family. So multiple family members with the same or related type of cancer. So if we see a family history with some colon cancer, some uterine cancer, some stomach cancer, that's raising our suspicion for a hereditary cancer syndrome known as Lynch syndrome. And so if we're seeing sort of a collection of certain cancers that can go together with a hereditary cancer syndrome, we start to think, could that be going on? And so this is a kind of a staple of what we do in genetics. We always take a family tree or a pedigree because this is how we determine what's the likelihood of someone having a hereditary cancer syndrome in themselves or in the family. So circles are women and squares are men, and these are the generations. So these here are all siblings. These are their parents. These are grandparents here, aunts, uncles, cousins. So in this family tree here, we have one woman, it's just shaded black to indicate a cancer, breast cancer at 62, and then her maternal aunt, breast cancer at 85. So we wouldn't really be overly suspicious of a hereditary cause of cancer in this family because although we do have 2 breast cancers, they're later in life. We also have lots of unaffected women in the family, and it doesn't really appear to suggest that there could be a hereditary cause. If we compare that, though, to a family history that looks like this is much more suggestive of a hereditary cause of cancer in the family. So you can see now, we're seeing, probably it is hard to see, but we're seeing breast cancer young, so say 32. This person has bilateral breast cancer. This person has ovarian and breast cancer. This man has prostate cancer. We're seeing multiple generations affected, younger ages of onset. So all of this is really suggesting a hereditary cancer family. Many families won't look like this or this, but somewhere in between. And so what I encourage all of you to do is figure out what's in your family history. So go home, talk to your family members, text them, Skype them, FaceTime, whatever you do. Talk to them. What kind of cancers do we have in our family? What other kind of medical conditions do we have in our family? Maybe you've always heard that grandma passed away from some sort of cancer here. Well, that's very important to know what kind of cancer that is. Is that a cervical cancer, a uterine, a stomach, an ovarian? All of those things are very important to determine so we can figure out what's the likelihood of a hereditary cancer syndrome. And there's great tools available online nowadays to be able to make your own family tree. So this is a great one from the U.S. Surgeon General's. It's called My Family Health Portrait. I have the link down here. So you could go online and create your own family tree. So it would ask you questions about your family members, yourself, what kind of medical conditions are going on in the family. So it's not just asking about cancer. And then it will create your own family tree. So you could bring that then to your doctor and talk to them about it and say, is this suggestive of anything? Or is there any kind of red flags going on in my family? Should I be getting any sort of genetic testing done? And then it's always important to remember that family history is dynamic. So family history changes. And so taking your family history 10 years ago isn't good enough. We need to keep that up to date. Anytime we learn about new things, let your doctor know in case that changes things for your own health care. So switching gears a little bit to go back to breast cancer. So as we've talked about 1 in 8 women in the United States will develop breast cancer at some point in their life. Same sort of slide that Dr. Chan had. Only about 5 to 10% of those breast cancers are hereditary, though. And the BRCA1 and 2 genes are the most common cause of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. So they are tumor suppressor genes. So that was that category of genes that I talked about. And they're important because they repair double-stranded breaks in our DNA. So our DNA is always getting mutations and changes to our DNA just from environmental exposures, lifestyle. Our DNA is kind of always getting damaged. But our cells have very important mechanisms in them to be able to repair those damages. And so that's what the BRCA1 and 2 genes do. They function to help repair double-stranded breaks in our DNA. So if your BRCA genes aren't working properly, if you have a mutation in one of them, then you have a higher risk of getting cancer, because if you have the one mutation and then you get that second mutation, now that cell doesn't have that important mechanism to repair those double-stranded breaks. Now you can accumulate a lot more mutations in that cell, leading to a cancer. And the BRCA1 and 2 genes, we're actually learning more and more that they're a little bit more common than we originally thought in the general population. We used to think these were really rare, but we think that general population is about 1 in 400 individuals will have a mutation in one of these genes. There could be thousands of different mutations, though, because these genes are very, very long, and so there's many different points along that gene where you could have a mistake. When we compare that, though, there's certain populations where it's much more common to have a mutation in one of these genes, and that population, one of those populations is the Ashkenazi Jewish. And so if you're of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, there's about a 1 in 40 chance that you actually do carry a mutation in BRCA1 and 2. And it's typically going to be one of these 3 founder mutations that Dr. Chan mentioned. It's possible you could have a mutation somewhere else in the gene, or maybe another gene, but oftentimes if you do have a mutation, it's going to be one of these 3. And like I mentioned there, it just accounts for up to 50% of families with hereditary breast cancer, and we think actually about 90% of families with both breast and ovarian cancer. So the risks involved with this, I know Dr. Chan already talked about some of these cancers here, but you can see how much more elevated they are compared to the general population. So for breast cancer, about a 12% risk in most people, we go up to from 38 to 87% lifetime risk. It's also a risk of another breast cancer, increased risk of ovarian cancer here. Men, again, can get breast cancer. Again, that's very rare, but we can see an elevated risk with these mutations. Prostate cancer as well for men. And then in some families, we can see this pancreatic and or melanoma cancer. And so I won't go through much of this because we've already sort of talked about this, but the importance of finding out if you have a BRCA mutation, if your family or personal history suggests it, is because there's screening prevention that we can do to help either detect cancer earlier or to potentially decrease your risk of getting cancer through prophylactic surgeries. And also sometimes it might affect your treatment for surgical decisions. And also there's newer medications that have come out that, depending on your cancer, if that's potentially metastatic breast cancer or very advanced ovarian cancer, there's some medications now that we can use to help with your treatment. And then I also just put these 2 things here. So Force and Bright Pink are 2 really great support groups and education websites that provide a lot of information, because again, when we're managing someone, we want to focus on your screening, prevention, and treatment, but also kind of about your psychological health and, you know, getting support from other people who might have gone through this and could help you. So how do we know if someone has a mutation, say in the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene? Well, we do genetic testing. So genetic testing is often done either through a blood sample or through a saliva sample. We take that sample, we send it off to a genetic testing laboratory. They will use a technology and read through all of the letters of those genes to see, is there any spelling mistakes in those genes? So when we get a positive result, that's what Dr. Chan mentioned, a deleterious mutation. So we know that the gene is not working properly because of a specific mutation in it. So again, if you're positive, we have the recommendations for certain screening, for management, for potential surgeries, And also then we know this is going on in the family and there could be other people at risk. So say a woman comes in, she had breast cancer young, there's a strong family history, we test her, she has a mutation. Now all of her children are at 50-50 risk to inherit it. So we can offer testing to each of them, particularly for that exact mutation that we discovered in that individual, to see who has it and who doesn't. So who needs all of this increased screening and prevention, and who's kind of, not off the hook because they still have the risk of cancer, but it's not as high as it would have been if they had inherited that mutation. A lot of the time, though, our results are going to fall into these categories. So negative, meaning we look through that gene, we don't find anything. It looks fine. We didn't find any mutations. There could be a number of reasons for this. Maybe there's a mutation still in that gene that our technology just couldn't detect nowadays. So our technology has changed a lot over the years. And so maybe, in years to come, our technology will get better and we'll detect some more of these mutations that we weren't able to do so today. It's also possible that maybe there isn't a hereditary cause of cancer for this family. Maybe it's a mutation in another gene, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about soon. Or maybe if someone, say, is unaffected with cancer, they come in because they have a really strong family history of cancer and they want testing. So we test them and they're negative. Well, we still don't really know what that means because maybe, say, their father had a BRCA mutation that he just did not pass down to them. Well, we don't really know that unless we were to test their father. So there still could be a mutation going on in the family that other family members are at risk for that one person didn't get. And then we have these variants, so variants of unknown significance. So changes in our genes that we don't really know what they mean, to be honest. We don't have enough evidence yet to conclusively say one way or the other, whether it is positive or it's negative. So we still treat these as a negative. So we don't recommend any kind of difference in your screening or your prevention. We don't treat it like it could be a positive. We treat it like a negative. And one thing that's important about this is because a lot of these variants will actually get downgraded to negative. So I think there's different numbers out there, but a lot of labs are coming out with these numbers where they're saying about 80 to up to 90% of variants that they've detected are actually benign. They don't do anything. And so as we get more and more evidence, more and more people get testing, we're able to make that clarification. Sometimes it will go up to positive, and the labs, when they find that out, will reissue a report so that you do know that you now fall into this category. But again, many of the times it will go into here. So who's the best person to test in a family? So I like to use this analogy. If you have a tree growing red apples, and then all of a sudden that tree starts growing a yellow apple, how are you going to figure out how that tree started growing a yellow apple? Well, you're going to want to test that yellow apple. You're not going to want to test every single one of these red apples to try to figure it out. You want to test that one. So same kind of thing with cancer. If we have a family history of cancer, it's always the most informative if we test someone with the cancer. But again, we know that's not always possible. Sometimes those individuals are deceased or not able to be tested for various reasons. And so if this family history is still strong enough, we still offer genetic testing to people who are unaffected to determine whether or not they could have an inherited gene mutation. So the landscape of genetic testing is changing a lot, though. So the BRCA1 and 2 genes are still very important for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, but they're not the whole story. So these genes were discovered, I believe, in 1990, and then they were sequenced and cloned in 1994, 1995. And then a company called Myriad Genetics started offering genetic testing for them, but they also put a patent on these genes. So they're the only lab at that time that were able to offer genetic testing. So they kind of dominated the whole marketplace because they held a patent. And that caused the cost of these genetic testing to go up a lot. And that's what it was like for quite a while. So really, if you had lots of breast cancer in your family, we were really only doing genetic testing oftentimes for BRCA1 and 2, and it was through the specific laboratory. But then the year 2013 came along when a lot of changes happened. So Angelina Jolie was one of those people in 2013. So you may or may not have heard about her and her story or read her op-ed. But in 2013, she wrote about having discovered that she has a mutation in the BRCA1 gene, and about her decision to undergo a prophylactic mastectomy. So that really opened up, I guess, the public's eyes to these genes and what they could mean for their health, and that created a huge increase in the number of people getting referred for genetic counseling and for genetic testing. Shortly after that, about a couple months later actually, the US Supreme Court made the decision to invalidate human gene patents. So they said you are not able to patent a gene because it's just naturally occurring. You cannot create a patent on something that's just biologically there. So, as this lady said, free our genes. So our genes were freed in 2013. And importantly, around the exact same time as this, our testing technology changed. So we were now starting to do testing with something called multi-gene panels. So instead of just looking at one gene and testing them one at a time, we had a newer technology that was being used where we were looking at multiple genes at the same time with one test. And the reason why this is really important is because BRCA1 and 2 is not the whole story. So they're still very important for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, but there's a lot of other genes that can lead to an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. So some of these genes might have a high increased risk, similar to BRCA1 and 2. We call those our high penetrance genes. But some of these genes might have a moderate risk of cancer. So maybe instead of the average population risk of about 12%, maybe they're associated with a 20%, 25% risk of breast cancer. So definitely elevated, but not as high as that 87% number that I mentioned earlier for BRCA1 and 2. And then some of these genes too, we don't really know what the risk is, so they're on the panels. We have some evidence to support that there is an increased risk, but we don't really fully understand exactly how high that risk is. And so we're still learning a lot more about these genes. And another thing too, I just want to mention, so at this point in time, before this, as I mentioned, it was just Myriad Genetics. Now there's a lot of other genetic testing companies out there that are offering the test because those patents were invalidated. And so if you've had genetic testing, you might have had it from a number of different companies. And so with gene panel testing comes some new discoveries, but also some new challenges. So one thing is that it is increasing our diagnostic yield. Some of the labs have released reports suggesting that, say, women who are referred to the laboratory for genetic testing with a family history, personal history of breast cancer, if they have a mutation, about half the time, it might be BRCA1 and 2, but about the other half the time, it's one of those other genes. So there's lots of other causes for this. We're also expanding our knowledge a lot because we're testing, first of all, a lot more people than we were able to before because testing costs have come down. There's a lot more labs offering the testing, so it's really sort of changed the way we're even doing this. And we're learning more and more about these genes. So some of these genes where we thought there was an association with one cancer, we're learning maybe not so much. Maybe it's more this type of cancer. So we're understanding a lot more about what these genes do and what kind of cancer risks they're associated with. But obviously when we expand our testing, there comes some challenges with that. So oftentimes when we're doing a panel testing, we might be looking at 20 genes, 30, 40, 100. So the more genes you test, the higher the chance you're going to get these VUSs, which were those variants of uncertain significance. So again, we're treating these like negatives. We're not changing your management based on those. But for some patients, that does create anxiety. They think, well, you found something. Why can't you just do something about it? Or why can't you test my children for that? Well, that's because, as I said, we don't know exactly what they do. And a lot of the time, those changes are just benign. But for some people, that is hard to kind of digest. Also, there's genes that don't necessarily fit with the family history. So let's say we're testing a man because he got male breast cancer. And so we're thinking, maybe a BRCA1 or 2 mutation might be going on or one of those other genes. But we find a gene that has nothing to do with breast cancer or male breast cancer, but has a really high risk of colon cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer. And there's no family history of that in his family. Well, we say, that's good, we identified this, and now there's a lot of screening and different things you have to do. But it's also, it's also kind of making it a little bit harder because we weren't expecting that. And is it really true that the chances of cancer are as high as we think when we're just testing people not expecting to find those mutations? So sort of almost more like general population testing. And then finally, too, when we have these genes that are moderate and lower risk penetrants, how do we handle these? So say there's a really strong family history of breast cancer. Say a woman has breast cancer, her mother had it, her grandmother had it, her sister had it. So we're thinking there should be maybe a BRCA1 or 2 mutation or one of those other highly penetrant genes. But we find a mutation in one of these genes that we say, okay, we think there's an increased risk of breast cancer, but we don't really know. Well, does that really make sense with her family history? Is that really what's going on? Probably not. Maybe it's part of the story, but there's probably something else. Is it another gene we haven't discovered yet? And what do we do then? What about her daughters who all want testing and her sons? If we test them and they're negative, can we really feel comfortable saying, okay, you don't have that gene mutation? Well, no, because there's still that really strong family history that doesn't really match with what our genetic test results showed us. This here is a picture not meant to scare you, but just to show you that there's a lot of different genes associated with a lot of different cancer types here. So it's not only about breast cancer. So I know that's what we're kind of focusing and talking about today, but there's a lot of other cancers out there that can be hereditary, can be caused by an inherited gene mutation. So colon, uterine, ovarian, pancreatic, prostate, lots of other ones. So again, going back to the beginning of the talk, thinking about young cancers, rare cancers, lots of the same types of cancer in the family. Those are your clues to suggest that there could be a hereditary cancer syndrome going on because, again, these are all a bunch of different genes associated with different cancer risks. So finally, I just want to finish up with some direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So direct-to-consumer genetic testing is a type of test that does not involve a healthcare professional. So this is a test that you can go online, you can go to one of these companies such as 23andMe, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage. There's a lot of companies out there that are popping up every single day. And you can go online and you can order a kit. It's usually a saliva kit. They'll send it to you. You can spit in the tube, send it back to them, and they will analyze your genes. And they will let you know what they find, depending on what that test is. So right now, it's not as scary as this, as going in a vending machine and getting it, but I think it's going that way, because from what I heard, I think some of these tests are being sold at like Walmart now, maybe, and various places around. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's going in this direction. I hope there's some more protections in place and people understand more about these tests so that they really know what they're doing. So direct-to-consumer genetic testing is different than clinical genetic testing, which is what I've been talking about throughout this presentation. So direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies often use a type of technology called genotyping. So this is kind of, you can think of it as like only reading specific letters in your genome. So they have a set of letters that they're going to look and see what letters do you have there, and it's not comprehensive. Compare that to clinical genetic testing, where we use a technology called sequencing, where we're looking through every single letter of that gene. So we're reading those letters, words, and sentences to get a full understanding of what kind of differences could be there. Where here, we're just getting a snapshot of different letters. And so 23andMe is one of these companies that is very popular. When I was pulling all these pictures, I have to say I kind of got stuck on their website for quite some time because it's a very nice website and they're very good at their job at marketing. So I can understand how they are so popular. Basically, they would send you a kit. This is your little spit tube here. You collect a saliva sample, send it back, and they would assess for various different things here. So for different traits, carrier status, some wellness things. They would tell you what kind of earwax you have. I think you could put your finger in your ear and probably figure that one out, but they, I guess, tell you based on your genetics what sort of earwax you have. They tell you about your ancestry. And another important thing is, this is new, but they tell you about some genetic health risks. So, as Dr. Chan had mentioned, BRCA1 and BRCA2. So the FDA approved 23andMe. They were the first direct-to-consumer genetic testing company to get approval from the FDA in March of this year to be able to order this test, to be able to offer this test. but like was discussed earlier, we're only testing for those 3 Ashkenazi Jewish founder mutations. So we're not looking at the 1,000 other mutations that could be going on in those genes. And it's also not looking at all those other genes that I've been talking about. So it's not just BRCA1 and 2. There's a lot of other genes that can lead to hereditary breast and ovarian cancer that are not being looked at in this test. So there's a sense of false reassurance with these negative test results, because is it truly negative? And another thing is that the FDA really actually does recommend confirmatory testing actually through a clinical lab if positive, because sometimes these can actually be false positives. So again, with this technology, it doesn't have the same sensitivity as sequencing does. So even if they detect, say, this letter G here, it actually might not be there. So it could be actually a false positive in their type of testing where they think it's there, but it's not. And so if anyone does actually have a mutation that they identify, it's always recommended and that they undergo genetic testing through a clinical laboratory to confirm, is that truly there? And something that's interesting is a laboratory had looked at, so what you can do too with some of these genetic direct-to-consumer companies is that you can actually download your raw DNA file. So although they're only reporting on a certain number of things here, people can download their file and send it to another company that then analyzes all of those other changes, and they'll sometimes report things like you have a mutation in a gene that's related to very early onset Alzheimer's disease, which this test company, 23andMe, wasn't testing for, but another company looked at your file and said, we found this. Well, it turns out that a lot of those results, again, are false positives. So it's not truly there. So people who are doing this are getting, concerned and obviously very anxious and worried when they find out this information, but it's not actually accurate. And so I encourage people to not necessarily do that, because it's not going to tell you, what you're really looking for. So I encourage all of you, if you do undergo direct-to-consumer genetic testing, to think before you spit. I'm not saying that these companies are bad. They're out there. They're going to keep being out there. There's going to be more and more of them every single day. It's very likely that many, many, many more people will undergo these type of testing. But it's important to think about, is this the right test for me? Am I just doing this for my earwax type and some fun things? Okay, that's fine. But are you doing this because you're really concerned about a family history of, say, cancer or some sort of condition that you're trying to learn more information about? Well, if that's the case, this is probably not the right test for you. And medical grade or clinical genetic testing is likely where you need to go and speak with your doctor or a genetic counselor about that type of testing. And another thing is that think about what type of information these tests are going to tell you, what they're not going to tell you. What are they going to do with your information? What is the privacy of these tests? What are they going to sell it to a third party, to pharmaceutical companies? Are they protecting your information? What are they doing with it? And also think about what are some of the unexpected results you might learn from this. So not only might it tell you there's a mutation in some of these genes, that, for example, with the BRCA gene, but sometimes there's been multiple stories out there in the media that a family all gets this testing together. They order a bunch of 23andMe kits. They all do it for a fun family Christmas party. Then they find out, well, dad's not really the dad, or sister isn't really the sister and maybe was adopted. So these tests can link you to your family members and tell you how genetically related you are to the other people you're doing the testing with. Well, a lot of people don't know this information prior to doing this testing, and it shows a lot of, it has a lot of potential for harm for families. So it's really important to think about that before you do this testing. So I encourage everyone, if you are going to talk to a genetic counselor first, we can really help you understand, is this the right test for you? Sometimes it is, and sometimes that's okay. But if you're looking for more medical information, sometimes it's not the right test for you. So you can see us before you do the testing. If you want to do the testing first and you got your results and you're in a complete panic, you can see us after your testing. I'm the only genetic counselor here, so I'm not going to be able to see everyone who does a 23andMe report, but there's a lot of genetic counselors out there. I encourage you, again, to go to this website. There's genetic counselors who specialize in this specifically and work in this field, and it can help you really understand what these results might mean.
So just a few take-home messages here. So as I said, all cancer is genetic, and really what I mean by that is just that it's caused by mutations in our genes, not that it's inherited, because again, only about 5 to 10% is caused by these hereditary mutations. I encourage you all to collect your family history and talk to your doctor about your family. And think about these clues of hereditary cancer: young, rare, multiple, and family. And BRCA1 and 2 are not the only genes associated with hereditary breast cancer or ovarian cancer. There's many other genes out there, and our genetic testing has definitely evolved over the years, and so has our understanding. Clinical genetic testing is definitely not the same as direct-to-consumer genetic testing, so please think before you spit. And when in doubt, talk to your doctor or genetic counselor. Thank you.
All right, so now all you people that have had questions stimulated in your brains, the Miracle of Living committee members will go around with pieces of paper and pencil, and we'll collect all of the questions. We're going to take about a 10-minute break. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll tell you, I did not expect nearly this many questions. And I think we're going to stump the panel on some of these. There's some excellent questions in here. So as everyone starts to take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to start with Dr. Chan. I thought this was an interesting question. Why is cancer development limited to certain tissues or organs in situations of hereditary abnormal gene predispositions?
Is that when we go?
I knew you guys are going to stump them.
Is that when you go past to me? Okay. So the reason for that is because not all of our genes are expressed in every single different type of tissue or cell. So, for instance, the BRCA1 and 2 genes have a very important role in our breast cells and in our ovary cells, but they don't have as much of an important role, or don't seem to, in other parts of our body. So if you have a mutation, say BRCA1 and 2, you're not at risk of every single type of cancer. While that mutation is present in every single cell of your body, that doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a cancer in every single different part of your body. So our genes are only important and only expressed in certain tissues, and so that's why we don't see, if you have a mutation, that you're at risk for every single type of cancer.
All right. What are the effects of growth hormones fed to animals we are eating regarding early puberty to girls?
Probably not what you think. I think it's a calorie issue, and a lot of the things that are put into food, growth hormone has to be given by injection. If you ate it, your gastric enzymes, pancreatic enzymes break it down, and it's not functional. So it's kind of unappealing to think that you're eating things that have been modified either genetically or by growth promoters, but it probably doesn't play a part in increased cancer risk. It's really a calorie issue, obesity issue, lack of exercise that puts us at higher risk. I mean, what do you think, Dr. Miller?
No, I would agree with that. All right. Blood markers to detect ovarian cancer, i.e. or such as CA125, are these no longer considered effective?
They've never been considered effective. There have been at least a dozen studies in the United States and in Europe that have looked at screening with blood testing with CA125, and the problem is that it has a very low sensitivity and low specificity rate. And what that means is that you can have an ovarian cancer with normal testing. If you have an abnormal test, it can be abnormal for non-cancer reasons such as any type of inflammatory condition in the pelvis. And I think the bigger problem is that the way that ovarian cancer grows is that We now know that it starts in the cells of the fallopian tubes. It's actually not in the ovaries. And it starts on the surface of the tubes, and the spread is really fast. So I've actually had maybe 4 patients who've had BRCA1, BRCA2 mutations. We go ahead and treat the breast cancer. We schedule them for preventative salpingo-oophorectomies. That's the surgery to remove the tubes and ovaries. I always get a CA-125 transvaginal ultrasound beforehand because I don't want the surgeon to be surprised. And I've had 4 patients where they've had cancer in the ovaries and it's spread. So it's not reliable, and it's not an early warning test.
And I counsel people all the time. In my years of practice, I've known several women that somebody screened them with the CA-125, got a false positive. These women had multiple surgeries, took out their ovaries, took out their uterus, all in the looking for a cancer that never existed. This is dangerous stuff. And I tell women all the time, I will not order a 125 to screen for you because that's not what it's good for. Probably do you more harm than anything. All right, what correlation is there with the birth control and breast cancer?
So, I think that there's not a lot of correlation now. There was a time in the 70s when birth control pills had very high estrogen levels, and I think that there was concern that it correlated with this increased breast cancer risk decades later. The problem is not having kids and not breastfeeding and not having the kids early. So, if you're on birth control pills, you're probably not having kids at a young age, and I think that's what's putting us at risk. Now, I have a very good idea of how to stop that, and that is that, we could take our 13-year-olds and we could give them 5 years of an anti-estrogen, like tamoxifen or raloxifene. I'm very convinced that it would decrease their breast cancer risk when they're 40, 50, and 60. The study will never get done.
So while we're talking about breastfeeding, I do have several questions on, is breastfeeding then protective for prevention?
Yeah, it is. It is if it's done at the right age for a long enough time. So if you have a child in your teens or early 20s, you breastfeed for 1 or 2 years, that's thought to reduce the breast cancer risks by about 1/3 later. But if you have a child in your 30s, it probably is not going to make a difference because you've had that 15-year interval where you're menstruating, you're cycling high estrogen levels, the breast ducts are not developing, they're not maturing, so they're just getting stimulated, and that's what puts us at risk, decades later. So it's the timing and it's the length of time.
And I've had several of these questions, and I think it is kind of a hard concept to understand, so I'm going to direct it to you folks again. How is the cancer rate developed if a woman never gives birth?
Well, I think that then it doesn't protect you. It just puts you into a higher risk group. So all of us, unfortunately, have increasing risks of cancer as we age. And there's reasons for that. As Lauren mentioned, we develop, hits to our genome, and we do have repair genes that fix that. It may be that at some point in time we just get too many hits and we get the switch turned on. And so there are things that we can do to lower our cancer risk as we age. There's nothing that we can do to make it zero. So cancer is definitely a disease of aging. I mean, if there's no other advances and we just extend our lives decades, we're just going to have more and more cancer.
If someone has a BRCA2 gene and genetic-related Crohn's disease, should they be more proactively screened for pancreatic cancer in the absence of having any relative with pancreatic cancer?
I'm not completely sure. So typically for BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, if there is a family history of pancreatic cancer, some people will undergo pancreatic cancer screening. If there's no family history of pancreatic cancer, we often aren't doing the screening. I'm not sure of the relationship with Crohn's disease. I don't believe that would affect that at all, but I'm not sure.
And then what is the screening for pancreatic cancer?
I don't know if you want to talk more about that one.
So the only reliable screening test for pancreatic cancer is endoscopic ultrasound, and it's done by a special gastroenterologist. It requires not just being able to do an endoscopy, but it's a 1 or 2 year additional fellowship where the endoscope has an ultrasound head. It's done under anesthesia. It's done in the hospital. The patient's put to sleep, and this scope is passed into the stomach, and right in back of the stomach is the pancreas. So they use an ultrasound, and they which is an echo that tries to pick up like a mass in the pancreas. If they see a mass, they actually can then put a biopsy needle through the scope, puncture the stomach, go into the pancreas, and take a specimen. So it's a very it's not an easy screening test. It's not anything that people want to do casually, and it's not even clear that you need to do it yearly. I mean, we don't really know what the regimen is right now, but in patients that have BRCA mutation with a family history of pancreatic cancer, the supposition is that maybe there's a 5% lifetime risk of pancreatic cancer. We're recommending that they do this EUS maybe every 2 to 3 years. There is a way to screen with a CT scan with a pancreatic protocol, but it's too much radiation to do as a yearly screening test. I mean, every CT scan is the equivalent of 100 or 200 chest x-rays in one sitting. The other way is MRI. But the MRI requires contrast with gadolinium, and there's concern right now that gadolinium is a heavy metal that accumulates in the body, specifically in the brain. So if you have somebody that's 35, they've got a BRCA mutation, family history, you probably don't want to have 50 years of gadolinium injections. So we don't have a perfect screening test right now.
All right, I have several questions on how much does genetic testing cost, and then who's covering it? Medicare, insurance companies?
That's a very complicated question. So
From somebody coming from Canada.
this is a whole new world for me. It's like the wild, wild west down here for genetics. So cost of testing can vary. A lot of labs, first of all, if your insurance does cover the testing, oftentimes it can be free to you. So either you have zero out of pocket or maybe a very low out of pocket cost of maybe, up to about $100 or so. That's if your insurance does cover it. If your insurance doesn't cover it, then there are out of pocket options that are much lower today than they used to be. So when I mentioned about Myriad holding the patent, I believe the cost of BRCA1 and 2 testing was around $4,000. Nowadays, if you want to pay out of pocket because you don't meet your insurance criteria, labs are offering options between about $250 to around $400. So it's definitely much more of an affordable option for many people to undergo this testing. Insurance, it gets very, very complicated. A lot of insurances will put their guidelines compared to the NCCN guidelines. So that's the National Cancer Comprehensive Network, which comes up with guidelines for genetic testing for things like BRCA and for Lynch syndrome. So a lot of insurance companies will follow these guidelines, but not all of them. And also, Medicare is one insurance that will only cover testing if you're affected. So if you don't have cancer, but you have a really strong family history of cancer, they won't cover it. So that's something that's quite frustrating and hopefully will change in the future, but for right now it's not. So again, you'd have to check on if your insurance would cover it, and genetic counselors can help you with that. A lot of times the labs will check for your insurance first, and they'll let you know before they run the testing what your out-of-pocket cost is going to be, and if it's going to be too high, your insurance won't cover it, then we can talk about other options, and sometimes they can offer financial assistance as well.
Several questions on what age can you stop having mammograms?
Pass.
I think that, I don't think that the guidelines are helpful from that standpoint, because it depends on a lot of things. It depends on if a breast cancer is discovered, is somebody well enough to go through the surgery, or were they well enough to go through the treatments? I mean, I have a patient that I've treated for breast cancer. She's like 92 or 93. She lives by herself. She drives to Del Mar to see the horse races every week whenever that season is by herself. I mean, she's somebody that's getting mammograms because she's got a life expectancy of at least 10 years. I think that it's hard to know when to stop. There are other patients that are, there are other women who are very ill in their late 60s who have multiple medical problems. Maybe they're on dialysis, maybe they've had, severe heart attack, heart failure. They're not going to be surgical candidates. Maybe they shouldn't be screened at all. So I think it has to be individualized.
And I'd appreciate your to feedback to me. A lot of times, women that are over 80, out there somewhere, somebody came up with 80 is the magic cutoff. And so I will ask the person, if I had x-ray vision and I could look at you right now and tell you that you had an early breast cancer and it could be treated with a simple lumpectomy and maybe a pill that you take, would you do that? And if you would, then keep screening, because if you catch it early, that's how easy it can be. If you say at that point, I still wouldn't do anything, well, then maybe you don't want to keep screening. What do you guys think of that?
No, I think that's a very good strategy, and I endorse that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's becoming much more individualized now, and it's much more of a shared care model, between the patient and the provider about what's best for them, not what's best for every woman or the average woman, but what does that depend on your risk factors, your family history, personal history, life expectancy, all of those things.
Okay. All right, so if someone gets a BRCA1 and or BRCA2 from each parent, so therefore there's no backup normal cells, does that change the risk profile for developing cancer in that patient?
Yes. So, well, it depends. So if you were to inherit a BRCA1 mutation from one parent, a BRCA2 mutation, you're likely going to have, we think, sort of the same risks as you would if you were just to have one of those mutations. So that's rare. It doesn't happen very often. So I don't think we have a whole lot of data around that, and I'm not as familiar. But if you were to inherit a BRCA2 mutation from one parent and a BRCA2 mutation from another parent, that actually leads to a different genetic condition known as Fanconi anemia. That is a childhood onset condition that leads to bone marrow failure, increased risk of childhood cancers. There can be other birth defects, and so it's actually a completely different genetic condition. So some of these cancer genes are inherited in both an autosomal dominant pattern and also an autosomal recessive pattern. So if you do inherit one from each parent, you actually get a completely different condition. Whereas BRCA1, we used to think that if you inherit a BRCA1 mutation from each parent, that wasn't actually viable, so that would cause that embryo not even to develop. There has been a few case reports now, I believe, of individuals with 2 BRCA1 mutations, one from each parent, that do develop cancer at a much, much younger age and sort of more of this Fanconi anemia phenotype.
Okay. Define family clusters.
So for family clusters is when we're seeing more cancer in a family than we would expect just based on statistics, but not that exact pattern that we see in these hereditary cancer families. So we're not seeing that dominant pattern where we're seeing people affected in every single generations, and it looks like there's about 50% of the people affected and 50% of the people not affected. But we're seeing more cancer than we would expect just based on, as I said, incidence and statistics. So maybe 3 cases or maybe 2 cases of breast cancer in the family with a smaller family, but it might not necessarily be hereditary. And that could be also due to potentially shared genetics, but also shared environment, shared lifestyle factors. So it's really hard to tease out in those families what is leading to the little bit higher risk of cancer than we would have expected otherwise.
What if that cluster has myriad type of cancers? It's not just
Yeah.
you see more of the norm of one type.
So again, that's it's hard to know if that's why it's helpful sometimes to come to a genetic counselor, because we can help to try to tease that out, because maybe it is actually suggesting a particular hereditary cancer syndrome. So cancers that the average person might not think go together per se, but actually might be associated with some sort of rare syndrome that they do all go together and they are all linked to a single genetic mutation. Other times it's not, and especially if a lot of the cancers are older, then maybe it's not a hereditary cause, because we often see them younger. But again, that's not a hard and fast rule, but we can help look at your family history and determine what we think could be going on. But again, we can't always find that answer, even if we think it could be hereditary.
And I think we all have to appreciate that this is still very young in our development of understanding. It will be so interesting to see where we're at even in 10 years, how much our understanding is going to change. What about outside factors for risk for ovarian cancer, talcum powder, or industrial carcinogens?
Pass to you.
So there was a number of lawsuits against Johnson & Johnson, and I think they lost a big case that was like hundreds of millions of dollars. The NIH actually did a study of talc risk in ovarian cancer and did not come up with any evidence to show that it was associated. That doesn't mean that the lawsuits are not going to continue. I think it's hard to know what the risks are for ovarian cancer. The lifetime risks on average for any woman is about 1%. If that woman developed breast cancer, the risk went from like 1% to 1.3 or 1.4%. It's still really small, absent like a BRCA mutation. So, they've looked at things like infertility treatments, whether that was associated with risk. I mean, at first they thought it was, then they thought it wasn't. There's some studies to suggest maybe that birth control pills were protective. When you have such a low risk cancer, it's really hard to tease those things out.
All right, this person has 4 family members with kidney cancer, a father, a half-sister, a brother, and a nephew, all refused genetic testing. Could I be tested to see if I could pass something on to my daughter or granddaughters?
Yes. So as I said in the presentation, that it is helpful to test the people who do have cancer, but we know that not everyone's interested in that testing. And so we can still test an unaffected person. Again, whether or not your insurance will cover that is another issue, but like I said, there's lower cost options that are now available. If we were to test you and we find a genetic mutation that could explain that kidney cancer in the family, then that obviously has a lot of information and would change your risks and your management and as well as that information for your children and other family members. But again, if we don't find a mutation, it's hard to kind of tease out whether or not there could still be a mutation in the family that you just didn't inherit. So we would still say that you are at an increased risk based on your family history, and we would still manage you as such.
Yeah, I think the screening for kidney cancer is really straightforward, and it's doing ultrasounds of the kidney. It could be done, once a year. I mean, it's very sensitive. You find small cancers in the kidney, so regardless of the genetic test, if there's a strong family history, that may be something that you can talk to your primary care doctor about, which is to do ultrasounds of the kidneys once a year.
I like this question because I think it teaches us a little bit about semantics. Can a benign cancer turn into a malignant cancer?
No.
So
I think that there's over the past couple of years there has been one of the reasons why the USPTF recommended switching mammograms to every other year is they felt there was an over-treatment of breast cancer. There's a percentage of cancer diagnoses in women where the diagnosis is called DCIS. It's Latin for ductal carcinoma in situ. I mean, that could make, in a good screening program like the one at Torrance Memorial, that could make up 25 to 30% of diagnoses. I mean, they're kind of put into the group of breast cancers, but they're non-invasive and they don't affect life expectancy, and they're overtreated. So we're starting with Cedars, a clinical trial that's opening now in taking patients with DCIS and actually not operating on them. It's actually, there's three studies in the US that are looking at it. This one's called Comet. But actually, if a woman has lower intermediate grade DCIS, if you look at what happens over 10 years, nothing happens. I mean, their survivals are identical. They don't get metastasis. I mean, it's like having nothing. And what the study's going to do is it's going to allow a computer to select. So this is why it's hard to enroll, because it's going to allow a computer to select whether a woman that has that kind of DCIS can be watched or operated on. And then after the computer makes the selection, then the patient has an option to get out of the study and choose either one, and she would be followed on a third arm. But I think that the betting from cancer specialists, breast cancer specialists, is that it's going to show that you don't need to operate on a lot of women that have low and intermediate grade DCIS. So there's a great gradation of cancer development where you first get cancer cells, but they don't have the kind of mutational hit that makes them spread. I mean, they're not technically benign because we don't really know that. I think that we're going to prove it, that they're often benign. They're not going to be not benign for everybody. And it's going to be, it's not so simple of an answer as yes or no.
I get this question a lot in clinic, so I want to hear you guys. It says, since thermography can detect changes much earlier than mammography, why isn't it offered or covered?
Well, because it actually can't. And I know that there are centers that are promoting it. The insurances don't pay for it. And I think that's not to say that in the future that that they won't have a software that will be better to pick it up, but a lot of I think the gold standard is still mammogram, and I think that it's more sensitive than doing thermography. You have to have things of a certain size, and in terms of just regular screening that's practical, it's probably going to be the best for a long time. I mean, MRI is more sensitive. It picks up a lot of little things, but it picks up a lot of things that are not cancer. In women that have MRI screening, first of all, they get the gadolinium injection, and then they have multiple biopsies that are benign. So there's a trade-off in terms of how sensitive a test is in picking something up and how accurate it is in predicting that the biopsy will show cancer. So thermography has been around for like a couple decades. I mean, it's not a new technology.
And I'll just add to that for women who do have a mutation in, say, BRCA1 or 2 or one of these other genes, or they have a strong family history and maybe don't have, we haven't detected a mutation in the family, we are often recommending these additional screenings, so MRI and mammogram, because as Dr. Chan said, it is more sensitive, and if you have a higher risk, then sometimes those benefits of additional screening and more sensitive screening will outweigh the risks. But again, that's not for everyone. That's not for your average risk woman, where an MRI will pick up a number of things that, you know, aren't cancer and cause for a lot of harm. Whereas women who do have a much higher risk, there's benefits to doing more screening, and also at an earlier age, because we know those cancer risks are so much higher.
So you mentioned 3 founder genes, but only said BRCA1 and BRCA2. What is going on with that third gene?
Oh, so sorry. Those are 3 founder mutations. So they're actually in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene. So it's not that there's another gene. It's just that there's 3 specific spelling mistakes that we see much more commonly in individuals of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. So if you're of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage and you're fully, so it's both sides of your family, all 4 grandparents are of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, you have a 1 in 40 chance to carry one of those 3 mutations in either BRCA1 or BRCA2. And then that being said, there's also other genes that have Ashkenazi Jewish founder mutations in them as well. So it's not just those 2 genes. So if you were to come to clinic and we were to talk about genetic testing, that's oftentimes why we're doing panels now and why that's so much more helpful, because there's other genes involved.
My uncle and aunt both had pancreatic cancer. My father had liver cancer due to drinking and Hep C, but do I need to be concerned?
Probably. So pancreatic cancer is a more rare cancer. So if we're seeing 1 pancreatic cancer, if we're seeing 2 pancreatic cancers, the more cancers we see, the more suspicion raises. So familial pancreatic cancer is actually defined as 2 first-degree relatives with pancreatic cancer. And so it's potential that there could be a hereditary cause for this in the family. So again, I would encourage this individual to talk to their doctor about the potential for genetic testing, whether that's themselves that's getting that done, or maybe if those family members are still living, seeing if they would be able to get the testing done.
Is Lauren's practice limited to only cancer patients?
For the time being, yes. So I think I'm going to be busy enough with just trying to serve the community here. So I'm just limiting to cancer for now. There are other genetic counselors, though, out there. There's counselors at UCLA, Cedars-Sinai, USC, lots of other practices out there that do see people for other indications. So if you're worried about a family history of maybe various heart diseases or neurological conditions, or if you're planning children, if lots of different things that you could be worried about that might be genetic, I encourage you again to look at that website. You can go online and search for genetic counselors within your area, and it should come up with a list of the counselors that you could go see.
And I'm going to end with this question. Are they training general practitioners about hereditary genes? I find this interesting because I learn more about hereditary genes from some of the patients that I'm seeing, because it is hard to keep up on it. We don't have enough genetic counselors. So where is this going to go in terms of getting the information to the hands of who needs it?
I think that's hard to know. I mean, from what I'm doing, I hope to be able to educate as many people as I can as possible. So whether that's, patients and people in the community, but also providers to help them understand about what are some things they should be looking out for if you're a primary care doctor. What are these red flags you should be looking when should this prompt a referral to a genetic counselor to talk about genetic testing. And, I know the training programs nowadays are focusing a lot more on genetics, but again, it's definitely expanding probably much more quickly than everyone's able to fully understand it.
All right, I hope that everyone comes away from this with a little bit better understanding. Probably still a lot of questions, but a lot of those will be answered as well. Thank the panel. They've been very, very educational tonight.